Part 1. The Hook, plus Introduction, plus Law 1 and Law 2. Stop gripping so tightly, just for one moment. Let go. Stop convincing. Stop chasing. Stop raising your voice in rooms where no one is listening anymore. Stop throwing yourself against a door that you have not yet realized swings open in the opposite direction. Because there is something most people spend 20, 30, sometimes 40 years learning the hard way, through bruised knuckles and broken expectations and a slow, heavy exhaustion that comes from trying to force the world into the shape you think it should take. And that something is this. The force is the problem. The trying is what is failing. The grip itself is the reason everything keeps slipping away. There is a paradox living at the center of every conversation you have ever had, every relationship you have ever built, every deal you have ever tried to close, every argument you have ever tried to win. It is so deeply embedded in how human beings think and feel and desire that most people never even notice it. They just feel its weight, like an invisible current pulling everything slightly sideways, bending outcomes in directions they never intended and cannot quite understand. And the paradox is simply this: the harder you reach for something, the further it drifts. The more desperately you want someone to understand you, the less they hear. The tighter you hold on to a person, a position, an outcome, the more it fights to free itself from your hands. And the louder you make your case, the more firmly the person across from you plants their feet and refuses to move. You know this feeling. You have lived it. Every person alive has lived it. You have been the one trying too hard at the dinner table, over-explaining your point until you could see the other person's eyes glaze over. You have been the one who sent that follow-up message just a little too quickly. The one whose enthusiasm crossed some invisible line into urgency. The one who could feel the conversation tilting away from you even as you poured more energy into trying to save it. And what did you do in that moment? What does almost everyone do? You pushed harder, you spoke faster, you gripped tighter, you doubled down on the exact strategy that was creating the distance in the first place. Because everything in your instinct told you that more effort would close the gap, when in reality, more effort was the thing digging the gap wider with every word. What if the whole approach has been upside down from the very start? What if the real secret to being heard is knowing when to stop talking? What if the fastest way to draw someone closer is to stop reaching for them? What if the most powerful thing you could do in a negotiation, in a conflict, in a relationship, in your entire life, is learn the precise and patient art of stepping back? That is what the 14 laws you're about to discover will teach you. Not tricks, not games, not the kind of hollow manipulation you find in clickbait articles and forgotten self-help books collecting dust on a shelf. These are principles rooted in the deepest mechanics of human psychology, in the architecture of how desire is born and how resistance is built and how trust is earned and how influence actually moves through the invisible spaces between people. They will reshape how you see every conversation. They will change how you walk into every room. They will transform the way you understand what is really happening beneath the surface of every interaction you have ever had. And they all begin with a single, deceptively simple idea. The most direct path between two people is almost never a straight line. Sometimes the shortest distance between where you are and what you want is not forward, It is sideways. It is backward. It is the quiet, deliberate act of releasing the thing you want most so that it finally has the room to come to you. Let us begin exactly where you are right now. Law 1, the law of reverse desire. Want less to receive more. This is the foundation. Everything else you will read rests on this single principle, so it deserves your full attention, your honest reflection, and your willingness to sit with it until it moves from an idea in your head to something you feel in the marrow of your bones. Because if you truly understand this law, not just intellectually, but in a way that shifts how you carry yourself through the world, you will have already changed the way every relationship and every interaction in your life operates, even before you read the other 13. Here is the core truth. Human beings are drawn almost magnetically toward what appears to be moving away from them, and they are pushed almost reflexively away from what is rushing toward them with too much hunger and too much speed. This is not a theory someone wrote on a whiteboard. It is not a clever idea from a podcast. It is a fundamental feature of how the human nervous system reads the world. We are creatures who assign value based on scarcity. What is rare feels precious. What is everywhere and being shoved into our hands feels suspicious. What might disappear feels urgent. What will obviously wait forever feels ignorable. Think about this honestly. Think about the last time someone wanted something from you, and you could feel the wanting radiating off them like heat from pavement in August. Maybe it was a colleague who needed your approval on a project so badly that every sentence they spoke was slightly too eager, slightly too polished, slightly too careful. Maybe it was someone at a gathering who wanted your attention so visibly that the wanting itself became uncomfortable, like a hand gripping your sleeve that you kept wanting to shake off. Maybe it was a salesperson whose desperation to close the deal was so transparent that every word out of their mouth made you trust them less, not more. Maybe it was someone who cared about you, someone whose intentions were genuinely good, but whose need for your validation was so constant and so visible that it created in you not warmth, but a quiet, guilty desire to step back, to breathe, to find some space. What happened inside you when you felt that kind of intensity directed at you? Be honest. For most people, the answer is some mixture of discomfort, guardedness, and a subtle but real pulling away. Not because the person was bad, not because what they wanted was unreasonable, but because the wanting itself, the visible, urgent, uncontained nature of it, triggered something deep in your psychology that said, this does not feel right. This feels like pressure. And where there is pressure, there is something I need to protect. Now flip it. Think about the person or the opportunity that felt completely different. The one who seemed genuinely interested in you, but also genuinely fine if things did not work out. The one who was warm and present and engaged, but who carried with them a quality you could feel even if you could not name it, a kind of quiet completeness that did not depend on your answer, your approval, or your presence. Think about the job offer that came without fanfare from a company that seemed like they would be just fine whether you said yes or no. Think about the friend who never chased you, but was always genuinely happy when you showed up. Think about the person in the negotiation who laid out their terms with calm clarity and then leaned back, utterly comfortable with the possibility that you might walk away. How did that feel different? For most people, the difference is enormous. In the presence of that kind of self-possession, something shifts. You lean in instead of pulling back. You become curious instead of cautious. You find yourself wanting to be closer to this person, wanting to be part of whatever they are building, wanting to say yes, not because you were pressured into it, but because the absence of pressure gave your own desire room to breathe and grow on its own. The law of reverse desire explains exactly why this happens. When someone or something appears to need you, the power in that dynamic flows toward you. You become the one holding the cards, the one with the ability to grant or withhold, and because human beings are deeply wired to read the balance of power in every interaction, this shift makes you less inclined to give what is being wanted, not more. Because giving to someone who needs it desperately does not feel like a choice. It feels like a concession. And human beings want to feel like their choices are free. But when someone appears not to need you, when they are moving forward on their own path, with their own momentum and their own visible sense of direction, something very different activates inside you. Suddenly, you are the one who might be left out. Suddenly, the choice is theirs, not yours. And the ancient psychology of possible exclusion, the feeling that something valuable might move past you if you do not act, creates the exact desire that desperate wanting never, ever produces. This is why the most magnetic people you have ever met are not the ones who tried the hardest to draw you in. They are the ones who seemed least concerned with whether you came or went, not cold, not distant, not performing some theatrical version of indifference. They were warm and present and real, but underneath the warmth was something solid, something self-sustaining, a sense that their world was rich and full and moving in a direction they cared about, and that your participation, while welcome, was not required for their completeness. And that solidity, that genuine self-sufficiency, is what made you want to be part of their world. Because being chosen by someone who genuinely has options means something. Being chosen by someone who would have taken anyone means almost nothing. Now here is where this law becomes practical. This is not a call to become cold or detached, or to play games with your availability. That would be a cheap imitation of this principle, and it would fail, because people can sense performance. What this law actually asks of you is something much more important and much more real. It asks you to build a life that is genuinely full, to invest in your own direction, your own purpose, your own growth, your own relationships, your own projects and passions and capabilities so thoroughly that your sense of well-being does not hinge on any single person's response to you. When you build that kind of genuine foundation, the law of reverse desire stops being a strategy you have to remember to apply. It becomes a natural byproduct of actually having a life that matters to you. You walk into conversations differently. You sit across from people in negotiations differently. You show up in relationships differently. Not because you are playing a game, but because you genuinely have somewhere else to be, something else to care about, another path that excites you. And that reality, felt by the people around you, even when you never say a word about it, changes every dynamic you are part of. There is a concept in negotiation that captures this beautifully. Strategists call it your best alternative, the genuinely attractive option that exists for you if the current deal falls apart. When you have a real alternative, something you're actually happy to pursue, if this particular conversation does not go your way, your energy in that negotiation is completely different. You are not desperate. You are not grasping. You are interested, yes. Engaged, yes. But there is a floor beneath you that everyone in the room can feel, and that floor changes everything, because the person negotiating with someone who has a floor treats them very differently than the person negotiating with someone who is dangling over empty space. But this principle extends far beyond formal negotiation. It applies to every single interaction where something is at stake. The friend who shows up at the gathering with a genuine richness in their own life brings a quality to the conversation that the friend who is socially starving cannot replicate. The professional who has invested in multiple skills and multiple relationships brings a confidence to any single opportunity that the professional betting everything on one outcome simply cannot access. The person in the romantic dynamic who has built a life they genuinely love, who has friendships and passions and a sense of direction that exists independently of any partner, brings to that dynamic a groundedness that desperation will never, ever imitate successfully. Want less. Not because wanting is bad, but because the quality of your wanting changes everything. Want from a place of fullness instead of emptiness. Want with open hands instead of clenched fists. Want the way a person with a beautiful garden wants a new flower, with genuine appreciation and interest, and the calm confidence that the garden is already wonderful with or without it. That is the energy that draws things toward you. That is the frequency that makes the world lean in your direction instead of pulling away, and it begins not with a technique, but with a genuine investment in the richness and direction of your own life. Law 2, the law of the forbidden fruit. Restrict access to multiply desire. Every parent who has ever lived with a toddler has seen this law in action long before they could name it or explain the science underneath it. The toy that has been sitting untouched in the corner for 3 straight weeks, completely invisible, completely uninteresting, suddenly becomes the most urgently desired object in the entire house the instant another child picks it up. The snack that was met with total indifference at lunchtime becomes the only acceptable food in the universe the moment a parent says, "You cannot have that right now." The activity that generated nothing but complaints and resistance becomes thrilling the second someone suggests it might not be available anymore. And if you think this is just a quirk of childhood, a cute phase that people grow out of once their brains mature and their judgment sharpens, I want you to think again. Because the psychology underneath this is not childish at all. It is one of the most powerful and most consistent forces operating in the adult mind, and it is shaping your desires, your decisions, and your behavior right now, today, in ways you probably do not even notice. The science behind this is something psychologists call reactance. The term was introduced by a researcher named Jack Brame, and it describes something so fundamental to human motivation that once you see it, you will start seeing it absolutely everywhere. Here is the principle in its simplest form. When people feel that their freedom to choose something, to have something, to do something, or even to think something is being limited or taken away, they experience an immediate and powerful internal push to restore that freedom. The thing that was restricted does not become less appealing. it becomes dramatically more appealing. The restriction itself becomes the advertisement. This is why prohibition, in every form it has ever been attempted throughout human history, consistently produces the exact opposite of what it intended. When authorities banned alcohol, people did not stop wanting it. They wanted it more intensely than they ever had before, and they were willing to take extraordinary risks to get it, risks they never would have taken when it was freely available on every corner. When governments ban books, those books do not fade into obscurity. They become legendary. They become the thing that everyone whispers about, the thing that people will go to remarkable lengths to find and read, often investing the banned text with far more significance and power than it would have earned on its own merits. When a platform becomes invitation only, when information is labeled classified, when a community establishes gates and barriers to entry, the perceived value of what is on the other side of those barriers does not decrease. It skyrockets. The same dynamic is operating constantly at the most intimate personal level of human interaction, in ways that shape your relationships more than you probably realize. Think about the person in your life whose attention was hardest to earn, whose approval was not automatic, who did not respond to every message within seconds, who was not available for every plan, who seemed to be genuinely engaged in a life that was full enough to make their presence in yours feel like something chosen rather than something default. How did the scarcity of their attention affect how much you valued it? For most people, the honest answer is that the scarcity increased the value enormously. Every moment of their attention felt significant precisely because it was not guaranteed. Now think about the person whose attention was completely unlimited, who was always available, always responsive, always ready, always there. Loved, yes. Appreciated, perhaps. But valued with the same intensity? Usually not. Because what is always available cannot be longed for, and longing is one of the essential ingredients of deep desire. The law of the forbidden fruit has several applications that are worth examining closely if you want to understand how desire actually works in the real world rather than how we imagine it should work. The first application is what we might call the power of selective availability. When you make yourself, your time, your energy, or your attention genuinely selective, not artificially scarce, not coldly withheld, but genuinely directed and genuinely limited, because you have a full life and real commitments and actual priorities, you activate a gentle form of the reactance response in the people who value your presence. They do not take you for granted because your presence cannot be taken for granted. It is something that happens when conditions align, not something that is automatically on tap. And that quality of not always available transforms how your presence is experienced when it does occur. The second application is the art of the gentle discouragement. This is one of the most elegant applications of this law, and it works in ways that feel almost magical when you see it in action. In any situation where you want someone to move toward a particular choice, the instinct is to recommend that choice directly. To say, you should do this. This is the right path. Come this way. But direct recommendation often triggers resistance because direct recommendation feels like someone else trying to steer your choices, and the reactance drive does not like to be steered. The indirect approach, the gentle discouragement, works with the reactant's drive instead of against it. You actually suggest, subtly and without heavy-handedness, that the choice might not be right for them, that it might be more than they need, that it might require more commitment than they are ready for. And the reactant's drive, feeling the gentle tug of restriction, immediately begins to pull in the opposite direction, toward the very choice you wanted them to make all along. Picture this. A seasoned consultant sits across the table from a potential client. The client is examining a premium service package, the most expensive option, the one the consultant knows would genuinely serve them best. Instead of pitching it hard, instead of listing its features and arguing for its value, the consultant says thoughtfully, honestly, with no trace of performance in their voice, "You know, this package is outstanding, but I am not sure it is the right fit for where you are right now. It might be more than what you need at this stage." Watch what happens next. The client does not feel relief and move to the cheaper option. The client feels a tiny electric pulse of restriction, of being told they might not be ready, and something in them pushes back. They want to know more. They want to understand why the consultant thinks they are not ready. They begin to sell themselves on the premium option because the desire is now coming from inside them rather than being pushed from outside, and desire that comes from inside is 1,000 times more powerful than desire that someone else is trying to create. The third application is the principle of the implied gate. When membership in a community, access to an experience, or participation in an opportunity is framed as something that not everyone qualifies for, something remarkable happens to human desire. The gate itself, the restriction, the barrier, the velvet rope, becomes the most powerful advertisement imaginable, not because what is on the other side is necessarily extraordinary. Sometimes it is, sometimes it is not. But because the existence of the gate tells a story that the human mind finds almost irresistible. The story that says, this is something special. This is something not everyone gets. This is something that requires you to be enough. And that story, more than any feature list, more than any sales pitch, more than any logical argument about value, ignites desire. Because human beings do not just want things. They want to be the kind of person who gets things that not everyone can have. The desire for the thing and the desire for the identity associated with having the thing become intertwined, and the result is a motivation that is far more powerful than anything a direct pitch could produce. But here's where I want to be very honest with you, because this law, more than perhaps any other in this collection, walks a line that matters. There is a crucial difference between genuine scarcity and manufactured scarcity, between real standards and theatrical ones, between actually having something rare and valuable behind the gate and simply putting up a gate in front of something ordinary to exploit the reactant's drive. The genuine version of this law creates real, lasting value. Genuine selectivity about who you give your time to reflects the actual worth of your time. Genuine standards for membership in a community protect the actual quality of that community. Genuine rarity of a product or experience reflects actual craftsmanship and actual care. And the desire generated by genuine scarcity is real desire for a real thing, and the people who pursue it will find something that genuinely rewards their pursuit. The manufactured version, the artificial countdown timer on the website, the fake limited edition that will be re-released next month, the performed unavailability by someone who is actually desperate for your attention, creates short-term desire but long-term damage. Because people are more perceptive than the manufacturers of false scarcity tend to believe. The manipulation becomes visible, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And when it does, the resentment it generates is proportional to the desire it once created. The person who feels they were tricked into wanting something does not just lose their desire, they lose their trust. And trust, once lost to perceived manipulation, is one of the hardest things in human psychology to rebuild. So apply this law, but apply it from a foundation of genuineness. Make what you offer actually worth the pursuit. Set standards that reflect actual quality, not theatrical exclusivity. Be selective with your time, because your time is genuinely valuable and your life is genuinely full, not because you read somewhere that playing hard to get is an effective tactic. Because when the forbidden fruit is real, when it is genuinely rare and genuinely nourishing, the desire it creates is sustainable. And the people who reach for it are reaching for something that will actually feed them. Part 2. Law 3, Law 4, and Law 5. Law 3. The law of reverse pressure. Push less to move more. There is a principle in physics that most people learned in school and then promptly forgot, not because it was unimportant, but because no one ever told them it was also the single most useful thing they would ever learn about dealing with other human beings. Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Push a wall, and the wall pushes back with exactly the same force. It does not matter how right you are about why the wall should move. It does not matter how passionately you believe in the direction you are pushing. The wall does not care about your reasoning. It responds to your force with equal force in the opposite direction. That is physics. And human psychology, it turns out, follows almost exactly the same rule. The harder you push against another person's position, the harder they push back. The more pressure you apply to make someone change their mind, the more energy they invest in not changing it. The more forcefully you argue, the more committed they become to the very position you are arguing against, not because they have carefully reevaluated their stance and concluded it is stronger than yours, not because your argument lacked merit, but because your pressure, regardless of the quality of the content wrapped inside it, is experienced by their nervous system as a threat. And when the human mind perceives a threat to its autonomy, it does not open up. It locks down. Think about the last time someone tried to change your mind by pushing hard, really hard. Maybe it was a family dinner where a relative decided that your political views needed correcting, and they came at you with the full force of their certainty, their voice rising, their examples multiplying, their patience with your wrong position visibly thinning with every exchange. What happened inside you? Did you find yourself genuinely reconsidering? Did their intensity make you think, you know what? They have a point. Maybe I should revisit my thinking. Or did something very different happen? Did you feel your own position hardening almost involuntarily, like concrete setting in real time? Did you find yourself reaching for counter-arguments you had never even thought of before, not because they were good arguments, but because the pressure itself demanded resistance? If that second description sounds more familiar, you have experienced the law of reverse pressure from the inside, and you are not unusual. This is what happens in the vast majority of human beings when they feel pushed. The content of the argument becomes almost irrelevant. What the mind hears is not the logic. What the mind hears is the implicit message underneath the logic, which sounds something like this: you are wrong, I am right. You need to abandon your position and adopt mine. And that implicit message, no matter how eloquently it is wrapped, activates the same ancient defensive machinery as any other perceived attack on the self. The drawbridge goes up, the walls thicken, the capacity for genuine, open-minded consideration of another perspective shrinks to almost zero. And here is what makes this particularly painful. It happens even when the pusher is completely, undeniably, factually correct. Being right does not exempt you from the law of reverse pressure. The wall does not become thinner because your argument is better. The resistance does not weaken because your evidence is stronger. If anything, the combination of strong pressure and strong evidence can make things worse, because now the person being pushed is not only defending their position, they are defending their intelligence, their judgment, their right to see the world through their own eyes. The stakes of conceding have gone up, not down, because admitting you are wrong to someone who has been aggressively demonstrating your wrongness feels less like growth and more like surrender. So, what do you do instead? If pushing creates walls, and pushing harder creates thicker walls, and being right while pushing creates the thickest walls of all, what is the alternative? The alternative is one of the most counterintuitive moves in the entire landscape of human influence. You stop pushing. You remove the pressure entirely, and you replace it with something that looks, on the surface, like it could not possibly be effective. Genuine curiosity. Instead of telling someone why they are wrong, you become sincerely interested in why they believe what they believe. Instead of presenting your case with increasing volume and decreasing patience, you ask questions. Real questions. Not the kind that are disguised arguments with a question mark pasted on the end. Not the rhetorical trap designed to corner them into admitting a flaw in their logic. Genuine, open, I actually want to understand questions about the roots and the structure and the personal history of the position you want to help them move away from. And something extraordinary tends to happen when you do this. When a person is given the space to examine their own position without pressure, without judgment, without the looming threat of someone waiting to pounce on every weakness, they often begin to find the weaknesses themselves. Because most of the positions we hold in life are not positions we arrived at through careful, current, fully examined reasoning. They are positions we adopted at some point in the past, for reasons that made sense at the time, and then carried forward out of habit and inertia, and the simple psychological comfort of not having to rethink everything from scratch. We hold them the way we hold old furniture, not because we chose it this morning, but because it has been there so long that getting rid of it feels like more trouble than keeping it. But when someone invites us to actually look at the furniture, to really examine it in good light, without anyone standing over our shoulder telling us it is ugly, we sometimes discover on our own that it no longer fits, that the room has changed, that we have changed, And the realization that comes from our own examination is 1,000 times more powerful than the realization someone else tries to force on us, because it belongs to us. It came from our own thinking. It is our insight, not their lecture. The first principle within this law is what we might call the practice of genuine inquiry. Before you try to move someone away from their position, try to genuinely understand it. Ask them how they arrived at it. Ask them what experiences shaped it. Ask them what it gives them, what problem it solves, what need it meets. And listen, really listen, not with the part of your mind that is already assembling your rebuttal, but with the part that is genuinely capable of learning something you did not know. The second principle is the practice of honest acknowledgement. Before you engage with the flaws in another person's thinking, acknowledge what is strong in it, and do this sincerely, not as a tactical move, not as a spoonful of sugar before the medicine, but as a genuine recognition that most positions, even the ones you disagree with strongly, contain something true, something that was arrived at for real reasons, something that addresses a real concern. When you acknowledge that truth, when you say, I can see why you would feel that way, and I think there is something genuinely important in what you are describing, you are doing something that changes the entire emotional landscape of the conversation. You are telling the other person that you see them, not a cartoon version of them, not the easy-to-dismiss caricature, them, their actual thinking. And when a person feels genuinely seen and genuinely respected, their need to defend themselves drops. The armor comes off, not because you defeated it, but because the battle they were prepared to fight turned out not to be happening. The third principle is what we might call the practice of shared exploration. Instead of attacking a conclusion directly, you become curious about the assumptions underneath it. You ask gently, without any trace of gotcha in your voice, what would need to be true for this to be the best approach? And then you explore together, side by side rather than face to face, whether those things are actually true. This feels completely different from an argument. It feels like a partnership. Two people looking at the same landscape together, pointing things out to each other, noticing things the other person missed. And ideas whose foundations do not hold up when examined carefully in this spirit of shared inquiry tend to crumble quietly on their own. They do not need to be knocked down from outside. They just need to be looked at honestly. And looking at something honestly is infinitely easier when you are not simultaneously defending it against attack. The law of reverse pressure asks something genuinely difficult of you. It asks for patience, because removing pressure and creating space for another person to find their own way to the right answer is slow. It is so much slower than just telling them, so much slower than laying out your evidence and demanding they see what you see. The temptation to shortcut the process, especially when you know you are right, is almost overwhelming. But remember, the wall does not care that you are right. The resistance does not dissolve because your argument is superior. The only thing that reduces the wall is removing the force that is creating it. And the only thing that dissolves the resistance is the patient, generous act of giving another person enough room to find their own way to the place you wanted them to reach all along. Law 4. The law of the invisible leader. Guide by appearing to follow. Close your eyes for a moment and picture what power looks like. What image comes to mind? For most people, it is someone at the front, the person standing at the podium, the one pointing the direction, setting the agenda, giving the orders, commanding the room with visible authority. This is the image of leadership that was installed in us by every institution we have ever passed through. School, family, workplace, government. There is someone in charge. There is a hierarchy. Power flows from the top downward, and the people at the bottom follow or face consequences. But the deepest and most durable form of leadership operates on a completely different principle. It does not stand at the front. It does not issue commands. It does not make its power visible at all. It leads from the side, from behind, sometimes from a position that looks, to an untrained eye, like it is not leading at all. And it produces something that top-down authority almost never achieves. Genuine commitment, not compliance, not obedience, not the appearance of agreement, maintained only as long as someone is watching, but the real thing. The kind of dedication that comes from people who believe, truly believe, that the direction they are moving in was their own idea. This is the law of the invisible leader, and its psychological foundation rests on one of the most well-documented principles in all of behavioral science, the principle of self-attribution. When human beings experience a choice as genuinely their own, when they believe they arrived at a decision through their own thinking and their own reasoning rather than being directed toward it by someone else, their commitment to that choice is profoundly different. It becomes part of their identity. It becomes who they are rather than what they were told to do. And a commitment that is experienced as an expression of identity is extraordinarily resilient. Abandoning it would not feel like simply changing a decision. It would feel like changing the self. And changing the self is one of the most psychologically expensive things a human being can do. The invisible leader understands this and designs the environment accordingly. They do not tell people what to think. They ask questions that lead thinking in productive directions. They do not announce the right answer. They create conditions in which the right answer becomes visible to the people who need to find it. They do not demand compliance. They build a space in which the best choice feels obvious, natural, almost inevitable, and the people who make that choice experience it as authentically and completely their own. The first technique of the invisible leader is what we might call the art of the guided question. Instead of presenting answers, you present questions, but not random questions. Carefully chosen questions that illuminate exactly the path you want the other person's thinking to travel without ever revealing that the path was designed. What do you think would happen if we approached it from this angle? How would this look if we measured success differently? What would the ideal outcome feel like to you, and what would we need to change to get closer to it? Each of these questions feels like an invitation to think. And the person thinking their way through these questions arrives at conclusions that feel entirely self-generated. The conclusions were not accidental. The questions that led to them were not accidental either. But the experience of arriving at them, the satisfying click of insight, belongs entirely to the person who did the thinking. The second technique is the practice of genuine consultation. The invisible leader asks the people around them for their opinions. And here is the critical part. They actually listen. They do not perform listening while having already decided. They create real space for other people's thinking to shape the outcome. They incorporate what they hear. They adjust their direction based on genuine input. And by doing this, they create something that top-down leaders rarely achieve. A group of people who feel genuine ownership over the direction the group is moving in, because they genuinely helped create that direction. People who feel owned in are advocates. People who feel dictated to are potential saboteurs. The invisible leader builds a coalition of advocates because the coalition was genuinely involved in building what they are advocating for. The third technique is the practice of generous attribution. When a good idea emerges from someone in the group, the invisible leader names it, celebrates it, and attaches it firmly and publicly to the person who generated it. Several things happen when this becomes a pattern. The person whose idea was credited becomes deeply invested in seeing it succeed, because it now carries their name and their reputation. Others in the group observe that contributions are valued and credited rather than absorbed by the leader, which encourages more contribution rather than less. And the leader, paradoxically, gains more influence by giving away the credit than they ever would by taking it, because the act of generous attribution marks them as someone who elevates others. And people are drawn to follow someone who makes them feel taller, not someone who stands on their contributions to look taller themselves. The invisible leader is often the most powerful person in any room precisely because they appear to be the least. They are the quiet center around which the energy of the room organizes itself. They are the one asking the questions that others think with, shaping the frame that others reason within, creating the conditions that make the best outcomes feel natural and self-directed. And the influence they exercise, because it never looks like influence, never produces the resistance that visible authority always generates. Law 5. The law of emotional stillness. Withdraw your reaction to reclaim your power. Every form of emotional manipulation that has ever been used on you, every power play, every provocation, every cold shoulder, every guilt trip, every calculated outburst, every silent treatment, has depended on one thing and one thing only: your reaction. Without your reaction, the manipulation is a fishing line cast into an empty lake. Without your visible distress, the person causing it has nothing to work with. Without your anger, the person who triggered it cannot predict or steer your next move. Without your anxious pursuit of resolution, the person withholding resolution has no leverage at all. This is the law of emotional stillness. And I want to be very clear about what this law is and what it is not, because this is the one that is most easily misunderstood. It is not a call to suppress your emotions. It is not a suggestion that feelings are weakness, or that the goal is to become some kind of emotional robot, moving through the world without being touched by anything. Your emotions are real. They are information. They matter. The anger you feel when you are mistreated is valid. The hurt you feel when someone is careless with your trust is legitimate. The anxiety you feel when the ground beneath a relationship feels unstable is your nervous system doing its job. The law of emotional stillness is not about whether you feel these things. It is about the space between feeling them and showing them. It is about developing enough of a gap between the internal experience and the external expression that you have a genuine choice about whether, how, and when to let the other person see what is happening inside you. Because that gap, that pause, that breath of space between stimulus and response is one of the most powerful pieces of psychological territory you will ever occupy. In that space lives the difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is automatic. It is the predictable output that the other person was counting on when they pushed the button they knew would produce it. Responding is chosen. It is the deliberate decision to express what serves your interests rather than what serves the interest of the person who provoked you. Think about this in terms of what game theorists would call predictability. In any dynamic between two people, the person who can predict your response has an enormous advantage. They know which buttons produce which reactions. They know that if they say this, you will do that. They know that if they withdraw, you will pursue. They know that if they escalate, you will match their escalation. Your predictable emotional pattern is essentially a set of instructions they can follow to keep you exactly where they want you. Now imagine what happens when you remove the predictability, when the button is pushed and the expected reaction does not come, when the provocation lands and is met, not with the anticipated explosion, but with calm, measured, unhurried stillness. When the withdrawal happens, and instead of the anxious pursuit that usually follows, there is quiet, productive engagement elsewhere. Comfortable patience, a visible willingness to wait indefinitely for whatever the other person is withholding. The instructions stop working, the playbook becomes useless, and the person who was relying on your predictability to maintain their position of control finds themselves in unfamiliar territory, which is exactly where you want them. The first application of this law is in moments of direct confrontation. When someone escalates emotionally, every instinct in you will scream to match them, to meet fire with fire, to raise your voice because they raised theirs. And it might even feel righteous in the moment, but matching escalation is almost always a strategic error because it does exactly what the escalating party wanted. It moves the conversation out of the territory of clear thinking and into the territory of raw emotion, where the person who escalated first often has the advantage because they chose the battlefield. The alternative is what we might call grounded stillness, a calm, steady, unhurried acknowledgement of what is happening without matching its temperature. You might say something as simple as, "I can hear that this is important to you, and I want to give it the attention it deserves. Can we come back to this when we can both think clearly?" This response does several things at once. It demonstrates that you have not been destabilized. It shows empathy without surrendering your ground. And it gently but firmly redirects the interaction toward a space where you have considerably more strength. The second application is in situations where emotional manipulation has become a pattern, where someone has learned, perhaps over months or years, that your reactions are reliable and exploitable. In these dynamics, withdrawing your predictable response is not a single act. It is a sustained practice of responding differently, consistently, and patiently, long enough to genuinely disrupt the pattern. This is hard. It is hard because the other person, finding that their usual approach is no longer producing the usual results, will almost certainly escalate before they adapt. They will push harder, try different triggers, amplify the behavior that used to work, testing whether the old pattern is really gone or just temporarily interrupted. This escalation is uncomfortable, but it is also evidence that the shift is working. It is the last surge of a strategy that is losing its foundation. If you can hold your stillness through that surge, the pattern breaks. Not immediately, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of a tide that has finally turned. The third application is in the realm of uncertainty. In relationships and negotiations where another person uses uncertainty itself as a tool of control, the delayed response, the ambiguous signal, the decision that is perpetually almost made but never quite finalized, the long silence after a vulnerable message, these are all forms of leveraging your discomfort with not knowing. And the antidote is developing a genuine tolerance for the unknown. Learning to sit comfortably in the space of not yet resolved. Learning to continue living productively, even joyfully, in the presence of an unanswered question. The moment you genuinely develop that tolerance, the moment you can sit with uncertainty without reaching for the phone, without crafting the follow-up message, without filling the silence with your anxiety, you have removed the last and perhaps the most subtle form of leverage that another person can hold over you. Because the only power uncertainty has over you is the power of your need for it to resolve. Remove the need, and the power dissolves like morning fog in sunlight. And what remains is you, steady and whole and quietly powerful, waiting with the patience of someone who knows that whatever comes next, they will be fine. Part 3. Law 6, Law 7, and Law 8. Law 6. The law of the strategic concession. Lose the battle to win the war. There is an art form that most people never learn because it violates everything they believe about how winning works. It is the art of giving something up on purpose, not by accident, not out of weakness, not because you were outmaneuvered, but deliberately, clearly, with your eyes wide open, choosing to surrender a piece of ground that costs you very little in order to gain a piece of ground that is worth everything. Most people approach every interaction, every negotiation, every conflict, every disagreement as if every inch of territory is equally valuable. They defend the small point with the same ferocity as the large one. They fight for the minor concession with the same energy they bring to the major principle. They treat every moment where they could give ground as a potential defeat, and every moment where they hold ground as a victory. And they wonder why, at the end of so many of these interactions, they feel exhausted, and the other person feels resentful, and the relationship between them has been diminished rather than strengthened, even when they technically won. The law of the strategic concession is built on a principle so deeply embedded in human social psychology that it operates across every culture, every context, every era of human history that has ever been studied. It is the principle of reciprocity. When someone gives you something, anything, whether it is a gift, a favor, a piece of information, a moment of honesty, or a concession in an argument, something inside you wants to give something back. Not because you calculated that you should, not because you consciously decided to reciprocate, but because the drive to maintain balance in social exchange is wired so deeply into the human operating system that it functions almost automatically, even when you are fully aware that the initial gift might have been strategic. This reciprocity drive is one of the engines that made human cooperation possible in the first place. It is the invisible ledger that tracks who has given and who has received, that creates the social pressure toward fairness and mutual exchange that allows groups of unrelated individuals to work together, trust each other, and build things that no individual could build alone. And in the domain of influence and negotiation, it is one of the most powerful tools you will ever have access to. Here is how the strategic concession activates it. When you give something up in a negotiation or a conflict, particularly something the other party has been pushing for, something they believe matters to you, they feel the pull. The invisible ledger tilts. They have received and they have not yet given, and that imbalance creates a subtle but persistent pressure to restore equilibrium by giving something in return. But the concession is only strategic if what you gave away was worth less to you than what you positioned yourself to receive. This is where the art comes in. This is where you need to understand with genuine clarity what each party in the dynamic actually values, which is often very different from what they say they value. In any negotiation, there are positions and there are interests. Positions are the things people state out loud. I want this price. I want this timeline. I want this outcome. Interests are the deeper needs underneath those positions. Security, recognition, flexibility, control, peace of mind. And positions are often just proxies for interests, symbols standing in for the real thing. A concession on the position, which might cost you very little in real terms, can unlock enormous movement on the interest level, because the other party feels that they have been heard and that the balance of give and take has shifted in their favor. Imagine two business partners stuck in a disagreement about how to handle a new project. One partner insists on a specific timeline. The other insists on a specific approach. Both have dug in. Both are defending their position with increasing frustration. The conversation is generating more heat than light, and neither person is moving. Now imagine that one of them pauses, takes a breath, and says something like this. You know what? I have been thinking about this, and I think you are right about the timeline. I was holding on to my version because it felt safer to me, but your reasoning makes sense, and I want to go with your suggestion on that. Let us figure out the approach together. What just happened? On the surface, one person gave ground. They conceded the timeline, but underneath the surface, something much more important shifted. The other partner, who was braced for a continued fight, suddenly feels the tension in the room dissolve. The reciprocity drive activates. They received a concession, and now the invisible ledger is asking them to give one back. And the conversation about approach, which was headed for a wall, suddenly has space in it. Space created by the generosity of someone who was willing to lose the small battle in order to win the larger one. This principle works just as powerfully in personal relationships. In a conflict with someone you love, the first person who says genuinely and specifically, "You were right about that part, and I was wrong," does something that feels like surrender, but functions like a key turning in a lock. The defensiveness of the other person, which was being maintained partly by the need to protect their position against your attack, suddenly has less reason to exist. When the attack stops, the wall becomes unnecessary. And in that moment of lowered defense, The kind of honest, open, vulnerable conversation that was impossible 30 seconds ago becomes not only possible, but almost natural. The strategic concession is not weakness. It is sophistication. It is the recognition that being right about everything, winning every point, holding every inch of ground, is a strategy with enormous hidden costs. Because the person who never concedes, who is always right in their own telling, who never admits an error or a blind spot, does not build credibility over time. They erode it. We all know that perfection is a performance, and the person who performs it too convincingly makes us suspicious rather than admiring. We begin watching more carefully, looking for the crack, wondering what else they are performing, whereas the person who concedes with grace, who says clearly and without excessive drama, "I got that one wrong, and here is what I have learned from it," builds something that the person who never concedes can never build. A reputation for honesty, for self-awareness, for being someone whose judgment can be trusted precisely because they have demonstrated that their judgment includes the ability to recognize when it has failed. Give a little. Give it clearly, give it consciously, and give it in the places where it costs you least and buys you the most. And then watch the reciprocity drive do the work that arguing never could. Law 7. The law of the planted seed. Influence without the appearance of influence. The most visible form of influence is the least effective one, the direct pitch, the open argument, the explicit attempt to change someone's mind. The moment someone recognizes that they are being persuaded, something inside them shifts. A filter activates. A quiet skepticism begins operating in the background of their thinking, examining everything you say not for its truth, but for its angle. What are they trying to get me to do? Why are they pushing this so hard? What is in it for them? The very transparency of the persuasion attempt becomes evidence in their mind that they should not agree, at least not yet, at least not easily. This is why the clumsy salesperson, the aggressive debater, and the heavy-handed advice giver so often fail even when what they are selling, arguing, or advising is genuinely good. It is not the content that fails. It is the delivery. The forcefulness of the approach triggers defenses that make the content almost irrelevant. The mind is too busy protecting itself from the influence to actually evaluate whether the influence might be beneficial. The law of the planted seed works on a completely different principle. Instead of pushing an idea into someone's mind through the front door, where the security system of skepticism is always active, you introduce it through a side entrance so quiet that the security system does not even register it. You mention it in passing. You embed it in a story. You frame it as a question. You let it enter the other person's thinking so gently and so naturally that when it eventually blossoms into a conscious thought, they experience it not as something you placed there, but as something that grew from their own soil. And this is where the real power lies. Because when someone acts on an idea they believe is genuinely theirs, their commitment to it is total. There is no internal resistance to overcome, because there is nothing to resist. There is no skepticism to manage, because there is nothing suspicious about your own thought. The idea feels native. It feels organic. It feels like it was always there, just waiting for the right moment to surface. And the person who planted it has shaped an outcome without ever appearing to have tried. The first technique of seed planting is what we might call the art of the passing mention. Instead of presenting an idea as a proposal that requires evaluation and a decision, you mention it briefly, casually, without any apparent investment in whether the other person picks it up or not. You drop it into the conversation the way you might drop a stone into a pond, lightly, and then you move on. It might sound something like this. I was talking to a colleague the other day who tried a completely different approach to this kind of problem, and they were surprised by how well it worked. Anyway, that is a tangent. What were you saying about the timeline? Do you see what happened there? The idea was introduced. A different approach exists, and it worked well for someone. But it was not pitched. It was not argued. It was not even fully explained. It was mentioned and then released, left floating in the conversation like a leaf on water. And the other person, whose defenses were never activated because nothing was being sold, is now free to pick it up or leave it. If something in them resonates with it, if it connects with a problem they have been turning over in the back of their mind, they will reach for it on their own. And when they do, it will feel like their own discovery. The second technique is the method of the reflected success. Instead of recommending the course of action directly, which triggers the resistance of being told what to do, you share a story about someone else who took that action and what happened as a result. Not as an argument, not as a thinly veiled suggestion, just as an interesting thing that happened to someone else, told with genuine enthusiasm and genuine detail. You might say something like, I read about a team in Berlin that was facing almost exactly this kind of challenge. And instead of the conventional approach, they tried something completely counterintuitive. They actually scaled back their marketing and focused entirely on deepening their existing relationships. And within 6 months, their growth accelerated faster than it had during their entire previous expansion push. Is that not fascinating? You have not told the other person what to do. You have not even implied that they should do anything. You have told them a story. But the story contains the idea, and the idea enters their thinking without triggering any of the defenses that a direct recommendation would have activated. If the idea is right for them, if it speaks to something they are struggling with, it will take root. Not because you forced it in, but because you created the conditions for it to grow. The third technique is perhaps the most elegant of all. It is the art of the question that carries its answer inside it. A well-constructed question does something that no statement can do. It engages the other person's own thinking rather than asking them to accept yours. It invites their imagination into a space where the idea you want them to consider is already waiting. What would it look like if you approached this from the completely opposite direction? This is not a statement about what they should do. It is an invitation to picture something. And the act of picturing it, of mentally constructing the scenario the question describes, plants the idea more deeply than any argument could. Because the picture was built by their own mind. The imagination was theirs. The scenario they constructed belongs to them. And an idea that belongs to you is an idea you are inclined to defend rather than resist. The law of the planted seed requires something that the direct approach does not. It requires patience. Real patience, the kind that can plant something on Tuesday and wait for it to bloom on its own schedule, which might be Thursday or might be next month or might be never, because the truth about indirect influence is that you cannot control the timeline. You can only create the conditions and then step back and trust the process. And that stepping back, that willingness to release control over when and how and whether the idea takes hold, is itself a form of respect. The respect of trusting another person's mind to do its own work at its own pace, in its own way. Law 8, the law of the generous mirror. Reflect people into their best selves. Here is something about human beings that is both beautiful and a little terrifying. We do not know who we are in isolation. We discover who we are in the eyes of other people. The way you see me shapes the way I see myself. The story you tell about who I am becomes, over time, part of the story I tell about who I am. Your perception of my capabilities quietly adjusts my perception of my own capabilities. Your belief in what I might become whispers to me at night about what I might actually be able to do. We are not sealed containers of fixed identity. We are mirrors, reflecting mirrors, endlessly shaped and reshaped by the quality of attention we receive from the people around us. This is the law of the generous mirror, and in its deepest application, it is not a manipulation at all. It is one of the most profound gifts one human being can give another. The gift of being seen not just as who you are right now, but as who you are in the process of becoming. The most well-known demonstration of this principle in behavioral science is a phenomenon studied extensively in educational settings. Researchers found that when teachers were told, even falsely, that certain students were on the verge of an intellectual breakthrough, those students genuinely performed better than their peers over the following months. Not because the prediction was accurate, it was completely random, but because the teacher's belief changed their behavior toward those students in dozens of subtle ways. They called on them more often. They gave them harder problems. They waited longer for their answers, communicating through that patience an implicit faith that the answer was coming and was worth waiting for. They interpreted mistakes as part of a learning process rather than as evidence of limitation. And the students, held in this more generous perception, rose toward it. They became what the mirror told them they could be. This works everywhere, not just in classrooms. It works in families, in friendships, in workplaces, in mentoring relationships, in romantic partnerships, in every human context where one person has the ability to define for another person what they see when they look at them. Think about the most influential person in your own life, not the one who gave you the most advice, not the one who corrected you the most or pushed you the hardest, the one who actually changed the trajectory of who you became. For most people, when they really think about it, that person was someone who saw something in them, something they could not yet see in themselves, someone who held up a mirror that reflected back not just their current reality, but their potential, someone who said, in words or in actions or in the quality of their attention, I see something in you that you have not found yet, and I believe in it completely. That experience of being seen generously, of being held in a perception that is larger than your current self-image, is one of the most transformative things a human being can encounter. Because the mind does something remarkable with that kind of perception. It begins to orient toward it. It begins to ask, almost unconsciously, what would the person they see in me do right now? How would that version of me handle this? And in asking those questions, in reaching toward the mirror, the person begins to grow into the reflection, not because they were pushed, not because they were instructed, but because they were seen, and the seeing itself created a direction to grow toward. The practice of the generous mirror involves several specific elements, and each one matters. The first is the element of precise recognition. Vague praise is nice, but it evaporates almost immediately. You are amazing. You are so talented. You are really great at this. These statements create a brief warm feeling, and then they are gone, because they do not connect to anything specific enough to build on. Precise recognition is different. It is the act of naming exactly what you see, with enough detail that the other person knows you were actually paying attention. It sounds like this. The way you handled that conversation was remarkable. You noticed that she was getting defensive before anyone else in the room picked up on it, and you shifted the entire tone of the discussion with one question. That ability to read a room and adjust in real time is genuinely rare, and I want you to know I noticed it. Do you feel the difference? The first version says, "You are great." The second version says, "I saw you specifically doing something specific, and it mattered." And being specifically seen is an experience of a completely different order than being generically praised. The second element is the articulation of potential. This is where the mirror becomes truly generous. You speak to what you see the person becoming, not as a pressure, not as an expectation they must live up to, but as a genuine expression of something you perceive in them that they may not yet perceive in themselves. I know this is hard for you right now, and I know you are not sure you are ready for this kind of responsibility. But I want to tell you something I believe completely. The person you are growing into is someone who handles exactly this kind of challenge with real authority. I have watched you develop over the past year, and I can see it clearly, even if you cannot see it yet. You are closer than you think. That kind of statement does not command. It does not instruct. It does not apply pressure. It holds up a mirror and says, "Here is what I see." And the person looking into that mirror, if they trust the one holding it, begins to orient toward the reflection. They begin to wonder, what if they are right? What if I am closer than I think? What if the person they see in me is already in here, just waiting for me to step into it? And that wondering is the beginning of genuine transformation. The third element is the element of consistent witnessing. A single generous reflection is powerful, but temporary. The mirror that truly changes someone's self-perception is the one that holds its reflection consistently over time. When a person knows that you see them clearly, that your generous perception of them is not a one-time compliment, but a sustained quality of how you hold them in your awareness, that consistency becomes part of their internal architecture. Your mirror becomes, over time, one of their own mirrors. The way you see them becomes part of how they see themselves. And the image they carry forward, the one that guides their choices and shapes their courage and sustains them in moments of doubt, is partly an internalization of the reflection you provided. This is why the people who matter most in our lives, the ones who genuinely altered who we became, are rarely the ones who gave us the most information or the most correction. They are the ones who saw us most clearly and most generously, who believed in a version of us that we had not yet met, who held up a mirror so steady and so kind that we could not help but grow toward what it showed us. And the extraordinary thing about this law is that it costs nothing to practice. You do not need authority or credentials or a special position. You only need the willingness to look at another person with genuine attention, to see what is actually there, including what is trying to emerge, and to tell them what you see with enough specificity and enough consistency that they begin to believe it too. That is the generous mirror. Hold it up for the people around you, not as a strategy, though it will transform your influence, not as a technique, though it will deepen every relationship you have. Hold it up because it is one of the most beautiful things a human being can do for another human being. To see them clearly, to see them generously, and to reflect back to them the person they are becoming. Part 4, Law 9, Law 10, and Law 11. Law 9, the law of the calibrated absence. Be missed to be valued. There is a faucet in your kitchen. It runs water every time you turn the handle. You have used it 10,000 times. You do not think about it. You do not feel grateful for it when you fill a glass. You do not pause before turning it on and appreciate the engineering that brings clean water to your fingertips in an instant. It is simply there, always available, always ready, invisible in its reliability. Now imagine that one morning you turn the handle and nothing comes out. No water, no sound, nothing. How quickly does that faucet, that completely invisible, completely taken for granted piece of your daily existence, become the most important object in your house? How fast does the absence of something you never noticed transform it into something you cannot stop thinking about? This is not just a story about plumbing. This is a story about you, about your presence, about your attention, about your time and your energy and your love and every single thing you give to the people and the projects and the relationships in your life. Because the psychology that makes you suddenly desperate for water when the faucet stops working is the exact same psychology that operates in every human relationship you have ever been part of. What is always there becomes invisible. What suddenly disappears becomes urgent. What is reliably, endlessly, unconditionally available is valued at a fraction of its true worth. And what is present sometimes, genuinely and warmly present, but also genuinely and legitimately absent at other times, is valued at a premium that constant availability can never command. This is the law of the calibrated absence. And before we go any further, I want to be very clear about what this law is asking of you. It is not asking you to play games. It is not asking you to manufacture fake unavailability, to leave messages unread on purpose, to cancel plans for the theatrical effect of seeming busy, or to withhold your presence as a punishment or a power play. That kind of performed scarcity is manipulation, and it is the cheap, brittle, ultimately self-defeating imitation of something that is supposed to be genuine. What this law is actually asking is something much deeper and much more important. It is asking you to build a life so genuinely rich, so authentically full of purpose and passion and projects and relationships that matter, that your absence from any single person or context is real, not theatrical, real, a genuine consequence of the fact that you have somewhere else to be, something else to care about, another part of your life that is calling for your attention and deserving of it. The person who is always available, who responds to every message within minutes, who fills every gap in the conversation, who makes themselves endlessly and unconditionally present in any single relationship, does something to that relationship that they almost never intend. They remove the space, and space, it turns out, is where longing lives. Space is where appreciation grows. Space is where the other person has the room to notice your absence, to feel the shape of the hole you left when you stepped away, and to realize with a clarity that your constant presence would never have allowed how much your presence actually means to them. Think about the friendships in your life that have the most warmth, the most depth, the most joy when you come together. Are they the ones where you see each other every single day, where every moment is shared, where there is never a gap? Or are they the ones where you come together after time apart, where each reunion carries a charge of genuine excitement, where the conversation flows with extra energy because there are new stories to tell, new experiences to share, new versions of each other to discover? For most people, the richest friendships have rhythm, presence and absence, togetherness and space, the music and the silence that makes the music matter. The law of the calibrated absence applies with particular power in romantic and intimate relationships. The person who makes a partner the singular focus of their emotional and social existence, who abandons their own friendships, their own interests, their own sources of fulfillment in order to be maximally available to the relationship, does not strengthen that relationship. They slowly suffocate it. Because desire needs room. Attraction needs mystery. Love needs the experience of missing someone in order to fully feel the experience of having them. The partner who is always there, always available, always accessible, cannot be longed for. And longing, that ache of wanting someone who is not right here, right now, is one of the essential fuels that keeps desire alive over the long arc of a relationship. This does not mean you should be distant or unreliable or emotionally unavailable. It means you should be whole. It means you should have a life that is genuinely yours, with interests and friendships and pursuits that exist independently of any single relationship, so that your presence in that relationship is something you bring from a place of fullness, rather than something you offer from a place of emptiness. The person who shows up to a relationship full, who has been somewhere and done something and thought about something that had nothing to do with the other person, brings a vitality to that relationship that the person who has been waiting by the door simply cannot match. The same principle operates in professional contexts. The consultant who is available at every hour of every day, who responds to every email within minutes, who makes the client feel like their only priority, gradually erodes the perception of their own value, because value, in the professional world as in every other domain of human psychology, is intimately tied to scarcity. The advisor, who is engaged and responsive, but also clearly in demand, who has other commitments that occasionally require the client to wait, who is not instantly available but is reliably reachable, creates around their expertise a quality of perceived worth that the always-on consultant slowly destroys. Part 4. Law 9, Law 10, and Law 11. Law 9. The law of the calibrated absence. Be missed to be valued. There is a faucet in your kitchen. It runs water every time you turn the handle. You have used it 10,000 times. You do not think about it. You do not feel grateful for it when you fill a glass. You do not pause before turning it on and appreciate the engineering that brings clean water to your fingertips in an instant. It is simply there, always available, always ready, invisible in its reliability. Now imagine that one morning you turn the handle and nothing comes out. No water, no sound, nothing. How quickly does that faucet, that completely invisible, completely taken for granted piece of your daily existence, become the most important object in your house? How fast does the absence of something you never noticed transform it into something you cannot stop thinking about? This is not just a story about plumbing. This is a story about you, about your presence, about your attention, about your time and your energy and your love and every single thing you give to the people and the projects and the relationships in your life. Because the psychology that makes you suddenly desperate for water when the faucet stops working is the exact same psychology that operates in every human relationship you have ever been part of. What is always there becomes invisible. What suddenly disappears becomes urgent. What is reliably, endlessly, unconditionally available is valued at a fraction of its true worth. And what is present sometimes, genuinely and warmly present, but also genuinely and legitimately absent at other times, is valued at a premium that constant availability can never command. This is the law of the calibrated absence. And before we go any further, I want to be very clear about what this law is asking of you. It is not asking you to play games. It is not asking you to manufacture fake unavailability, to leave messages unread on purpose, to cancel plans for the theatrical effect of seeming busy, or to withhold your presence as a punishment or a power play. That kind of performed scarcity is manipulation, and it is the cheap, brittle, ultimately self-defeating imitation of something that is supposed to be genuine. What this law is actually asking is something much deeper and much more important. It is asking you to build a life so genuinely rich, so authentically full of purpose and passion and projects and relationships that matter, that your absence from any single person or context is real, not theatrical, real. A genuine consequence of the fact that you have somewhere else to be, something else to care about, another part of your life that is calling for your attention and deserving of it. The person who is always available, who responds to every message within minutes, who fills every gap in the conversation, who makes themselves endlessly and unconditionally present in any single relationship, does something to that relationship that they almost never intend. They remove the space, and space, it turns out, is where longing lives. Space is where appreciation grows. Space is where the other person has the room to notice your absence, to feel the shape of the hole you left when you stepped away, and to realize, with a clarity that your constant presence would never have allowed, how much your presence actually means to them. Think about the friendships in your life that have the most warmth, the most depth, the most joy when you come together. Are they the ones where you see each other every single day, where every moment is shared, where there is never a gap? Or are they the ones where you come together after time apart, where each reunion carries a charge of genuine excitement, where the conversation flows with extra energy because there are new stories to tell, new experiences to share, new versions of each other to discover. For most people, the richest friendships have rhythm, presence and absence, togetherness and space, the music and the silence that makes the music matter. The law of the calibrated absence applies with particular power in romantic and intimate relationships. The person who makes a partner the singular focus of their emotional and social existence, who abandons their own friendships, their own interests, their own sources of fulfillment in order to be maximally available to the relationship, does not strengthen that relationship. They slowly suffocate it, because desire needs room, attraction needs mystery, love needs the experience of missing someone in order to fully feel the experience of having them. The partner who is always there, always available, always accessible, cannot be longed for. And longing, that ache of wanting someone who is not right here, right now, is one of the essential fuels that keeps desire alive over the long arc of a relationship. This does not mean you should be distant or unreliable or emotionally unavailable. It means you should be whole. It means you should have a life that is genuinely yours, with interests and friendships and pursuits that exist independently of any single relationship, so that your presence in that relationship is something you bring from a place of fullness, rather than something you offer from a place of emptiness. The person who shows up to a relationship full, who has been somewhere and done something and thought about something that had nothing to do with the other person, brings a vitality to that relationship that the person who has been waiting by the door simply cannot match. The same principle operates in professional contexts. The consultant who is available at every hour of every day, who responds to every email within minutes, who makes the client feel like their only priority, gradually erodes the perception of their own value, because value, in the professional world, as in every other domain of human psychology, is intimately tied to scarcity. The advisor, who is engaged and responsive, but also clearly in demand, who has other commitments that occasionally require the client to wait, who is not instantly available but is reliably reachable, creates around their expertise a quality of perceived worth that the always-on consultant slowly destroys. Most people walk into important conversations focused entirely on their arguments. They have prepared what they are going to say. They have rehearsed their points. They have anticipated objections and prepared responses. And all of that preparation, however thorough, is operating at the wrong level. Because the most brilliant argument in the world, delivered inside a frame that works against you, will lose to a mediocre argument delivered inside a frame that works in its favor. You can win every point and still lose the conversation, because the frame within which those points were scored was never favorable to your actual interests. The first technique of frame control is what we might call the opening definition. The person who defines the key terms of the conversation in the first few minutes has shaped the ground on which everything that follows will be built. If you define the conversation as being about long-term value rather than short-term cost, about strategic fit rather than feature comparison, about partnership rather than transaction, you have already tilted the landscape in your direction before the detailed discussion even begins. This works in personal conversations just as powerfully as it works in professional ones. Consider two people entering a difficult conversation about their relationship. If the frame is who is at fault, the conversation will produce defensiveness, blame, and counterblame. Both parties will focus on building their case for why the other person is the problem, and the conversation will end with both people feeling attacked and neither person feeling heard. But if one person reframes the conversation before it starts, if they say something like, "I do not want to talk about who is right and who is wrong. I want to talk about what we both need to feel good in this relationship and how we can build something that works better for both of us," the entire emotional landscape shifts. The same issues might be discussed. The same concerns might be raised, but the frame of mutual problem-solving rather than blame assignment changes what is possible within the conversation. The second technique is the reframe. This is what you use when someone else has already established a frame that works against you. Instead of fighting within their frame, which is almost always a losing strategy because the frame itself determines what counts as winning, you step outside the frame entirely and propose a different one. It sounds something like this: "I think we are looking at this through a lens that is not going to help either of us get where we want to go. Can I suggest a different way of thinking about it?" This move does something subtle and powerful. It lifts the conversation from the content level, where both parties are arguing about specifics, to the meta level, where the question becomes which framework is most useful for examining those specifics. And the person who initiates that shift, the person who demonstrates the ability to think about the thinking rather than just being caught up in the argument, gains an immediate advantage because they have just demonstrated a level of strategic awareness that the other party now has to match or defer to. The third technique is the anchoring question. A carefully constructed question can establish a frame more effectively than any statement, because questions are received differently by the mind than statements are. A statement of frame can be challenged directly. You say this conversation is about value, and the other person says, "No, this conversation is about cost." Now you are arguing about the frame itself, which is exhausting and often unproductive. But a question that implies a frame tends to be accepted without examination, because the mind immediately focuses on answering the question rather than on analyzing the assumptions embedded within it. What would this decision look like if we were optimizing for where we want to be in 5 years rather than where we are right now? This question does not state that the 5-year view is the correct frame. It invites the other person to step into that frame and look around. And the act of engaging with the question, of mentally constructing the 5-year view and examining the decision through it, is effectively an acceptance of the frame. By the time the question has been answered, the conversation is already taking place within the frame the question established. And the person who asked the question shaped that outcome without ever having to argue for it. The deepest truth of this law is one that most people never fully absorb. There is no such thing as a frameless conversation. There is no neutral, objective, unbiased lens through which any human interaction takes place. Every conversation has a frame. The only question is whether that frame was chosen deliberately by someone who understood its power, or whether it was established accidentally by whoever spoke first or most forcefully. The person who understands this is never passive about frames. They are always choosing, always asking, before any important conversation, what is the frame that serves truth and serves my interests, and how do I establish it early enough that the entire conversation unfolds within it? Law 11, the law of the shattered expectation, surprise to create impact. The human brain is a prediction machine. Every moment of every day, it is running models, generating forecasts, building expectations about what will happen next. When the next thing matches the prediction, it is processed efficiently, but without emphasis. It is expected. It is normal. It is noise. But when the next thing violates the prediction, when something happens that the brain did not see coming, the entire attention system lights up. The unexpected event is flagged as significant. It is processed more deeply. It is remembered more vividly. It is felt more intensely. It becomes, in the architecture of memory and emotion, a moment that matters in a way that the predictable moment simply never can. This is the law of the shattered expectation, and it is one of the most practical and immediately applicable principles in this entire collection. Because if you understand that impact is created not by what you do, but by the gap between what was expected and what actually happened, you hold in your hands one of the most powerful tools for creating memorable, meaningful, relationship-altering moments in every area of your life. Think about the most memorable positive experiences you have had with another person, not the routine pleasant ones, the ones that stuck, the ones you still think about, the ones that changed how you saw someone. Almost always there is a surprise at the center. Something happened that you did not see coming. The person who you expected to be self-interested turned out to be genuinely generous. The leader who you assumed would take the credit publicly and specifically celebrated the contributions of their team. The friend who you thought had forgotten your birthday showed up at your door with something so thoughtful that it could only have come from someone who had been paying attention for months. The negotiator who you braced for a hard-line battle opened with an unexpected concession that changed the entire temperature of the room. In each of these cases, the power of the moment was not just in the act itself. It was in the distance between the expectation and the reality. The surprise is what created the impact. The violation of the prediction is what made it memorable. And this means that the deliberate, strategic management of what other people expect from you is one of the most important and most overlooked skills in the entire psychology of influence. The first application of this law is the practice of deliberate underpromising. Most people, driven by the desire to impress, set expectations high and then scramble to meet them. The strategic mind sets expectations slightly lower than what they intend to deliver, not deceptively low, not so low that credibility is undermined, just modestly, reasonably low, enough that when the actual delivery arrives, it exceeds the expectation by a margin wide enough to create genuine surprise. The client who was told the project would take 4 weeks and receives it in 3. The friend who was told you probably could not make it and then shows up. The partner who expected a routine evening and encounters something unexpectedly thoughtful. In each case, the experience of positive surprise creates an emotional impression that is disproportionately strong relative to the actual gap between promise and delivery. The surprise itself is the amplifier. The second application is the power of the pattern break. In any ongoing relationship, patterns form quickly. People learn what to expect from you. They build a model of your behavior, and they stop paying close attention because the model is accurate enough that close attention is unnecessary. You are reliable, you are predictable, and you are, because of that very predictability, gradually becoming invisible, not disliked, not unappreciated, just no longer noticed with any particular acuity. The pattern break is the deliberate disruption of that invisibility. It is the moment when you do something that the model did not predict, something generous, something bold, something unexpected, and the other person's attention system lights up and sees you again as if for the first time. This does not require grand gestures. It requires only a willingness to occasionally step outside the pattern that has formed around your behavior and do something that the other person did not see coming. The colleague who has always been professionally cordial suddenly shares something genuinely personal and vulnerable. The parent who has always given practical advice suddenly just listens, without fixing, without advising, just being present. The partner who has settled into a routine suddenly creates a moment of spontaneous beauty, not because it was a special occasion, but precisely because it was not. The third application is the reversal of negative expectations. This is perhaps the most powerful form of the shattered expectation, because the gap between a negative prediction and a positive reality creates the widest emotional distance and therefore the strongest impact. When someone expects conflict and encounters kindness, when someone braces for retaliation and receives forgiveness, when someone prepares for judgment and finds acceptance, the surprise is not just pleasant. It is transformative. It rewrites the story the other person was telling themselves about who you are and what this interaction was going to be. And stories that get rewritten in a moment of genuine surprise tend to stay rewritten because the emotional intensity of the moment burns the new version into memory in a way that routine positive experiences never achieve. The person who always meets expectations is valued. They are reliable, they are trusted, but they are not riveting. They do not create the moments that people carry with them, that people talk about, that people remember years later as turning points in how they saw someone. The person who occasionally, deliberately, at well-chosen moments, shatters an expectation in a positive direction, creates a quality of presence that reliability alone can never produce. They become someone who surprises, someone who delights, someone you pay attention to because you have learned that what happens next might not be what you predicted. And that quality of attention, the attention paid to someone who might surprise you, is one of the most valuable and most difficult to earn forms of human regard. Part 5. Law 12, Law 13, Law 14, and Closing Law 12. The Law of Strategic Vulnerability. Reveal your cracks to prove your strength. There is a kind of strength that almost nobody develops because it looks from the outside exactly like weakness. It is the strength of letting yourself be seen, not the polished, curated, carefully managed version of yourself that you present to the world like a resume in human form. The real version, the one with dents and scratches and stories you would rather not tell. The one who got it wrong sometimes, who doubted themselves more than they let on, who stumbled in places where they were supposed to be sure-footed. That version, the one you spend so much energy hiding because you believe somewhere deep in the architecture of your self-protection that if people saw it, they would trust you less. Here's the paradox. They would trust you more. The law of strategic vulnerability rests on a truth that is deeply counterintuitive, but overwhelmingly supported by how human beings actually respond to each other in the real world. The person who reveals a genuine imperfection in the right context and with the right composure appears stronger than the person who maintains a flawless surface, not weaker, stronger. Because every person alive knows that flawless surfaces are performances. We know it in our bones. We know that everyone struggles, everyone doubts, everyone fails, everyone carries something they wish had gone differently. And the person who performs the absence of all these things does not inspire our admiration. They trigger our suspicion. Something in us watches the perfect surface and thinks, what are they hiding? What is behind the mask? How much energy is going into this performance, and what would I see if it slipped? But the person who says, openly and without drama, I was not always good at this. I failed at it more times than I would like to admit before I figured out what I was doing wrong. That person does something to our internal trust system that the flawless performer never achieves. They make us feel safe. They make us feel that we are dealing with a real human being rather than a carefully managed image. And that feeling of safety, that sense that the mask is off and we are seeing something genuine, is the foundation on which deep trust is built. Trust that no amount of polished perfection could ever create. Think about the speakers, the leaders, the teachers, the mentors who have had the deepest impact on you. Were they the ones who presented themselves as having all the answers, as having traveled a smooth road from uncertainty to mastery without a single wrong turn? Or were they the ones who told you about the wrong turns? The ones who said, I spent 2 years going in completely the wrong direction before I figured this out, and here is what that wrong direction taught me. The ones whose competence was made more credible, not less, by their willingness to show you the journey rather than just the destination. For most people, the answer is clear. We trust the person who has been where we are. We trust the person who knows what failure feels like because they have tasted it, not because they read about it. We trust the person whose wisdom comes from scars rather than from textbooks. And we trust them more, not less, when they show us those scars. Because the showing is itself a demonstration of strength. It says, I am confident enough in who I am now that I do not need to hide who I was then. I am secure enough in my competence that admitting its history of incompetence does not threaten me. And that security, that quiet, unhurried willingness to be seen fully, is one of the most compelling forms of personal power a human being can develop. But the strategic element of this law matters. This is not a call to dump every insecurity, every wound, every unprocessed failure onto the table in every conversation. That is not vulnerability. That is overwhelm. And the person who shares everything indiscriminately does not build trust. They create discomfort because the listener is suddenly responsible for emotional material they did not ask for and may not be equipped to hold. Strategic vulnerability is selective. It is the deliberate, contextually appropriate sharing of specific imperfections that serve a purpose. The vulnerability that works is the one your audience can relate to, the one that does not undermine your core competence in the area they need to trust you in, and the one that is delivered with the equanimity of someone who has genuinely processed it. There is a vast difference between "I am currently fallen apart and I do not know what to do," and "I went through a period where I was fallen apart and did not know what to do, and here is what I eventually learned." The first is a crisis. The second is wisdom. Both are honest. But only the second builds the kind of trust that strengthens your position rather than weakening it. The leader who tells their team, "I made a significant mistake on a project early in my career, and it taught me something I carry into every decision I make now," has done something remarkable. They have simultaneously demonstrated humility, self-awareness, resilience, and the kind of hard-won judgment that only comes from having gotten it wrong and survived. Every one of those qualities increases trust. Every one of them makes the people listening feel that they are in the presence of someone genuine, someone who has been tested and who emerged from the testing with something real to offer. Show your cracks, not all of them, not to everyone, not in every moment, but in the moments that matter, in the contexts where trust is the currency that everything else depends on. Let yourself be seen. Let the mask come down far enough that the people looking at you recognize a fellow human being rather than a performance. Because that recognition, that moment of, "Oh, they are real, they are like me, they have struggled too," is the moment when trust stops being theoretical and becomes felt. And felt trust is the only kind that actually holds weight when the stakes get high. Law 13, the law of the deferred victory. Surrender the small to secure the significant. In every ongoing relationship, whether it is a marriage, a friendship, a business partnership, or any other sustained connection between two human beings, there is a continuous, mostly invisible negotiation happening beneath the surface of daily life. Whose preference gets priority tonight? Whose interpretation of what happened is accepted as the official version? Whose taste shapes the decision? Whose schedule takes precedence? Whose comfort is centered when resources are limited? These are the small battles. They happen constantly, most of them so minor that they barely register as conflicts at all. And yet, the way you handle them, the pattern you establish around these tiny daily negotiations of whose will prevails, determines the quality and the durability and the depth of the relationship more than almost anything else. Most people fight the small battles as if they were the big ones. They hold their ground on the restaurant choice. They insist on their version of what happened in the argument last Tuesday. They push for their preferred plan on the weekend. They claim the small victory, and they do it so reflexively, so automatically, that they do not even notice they are doing it. It is not malice. It is not even conscious strategy. It is just the default human setting. My preference matters. My version is correct. My choice should prevail. And every time that default wins, every time the small battle is claimed and the small victory is pocketed, something invisible is spent. Something is withdrawn from an account the person does not even know exists. The account of goodwill. The law of the deferred victory is built on the recognition that goodwill in any ongoing relationship is a more valuable asset than being right. And it is an asset that is accumulated in one way and one way only: by giving, by letting the other person have the small win, by saying, "You know what? Let us do it your way tonight." By choosing deliberately and graciously and without keeping score. 2. Defer on the things that do not actually matter, so that you have something in the relational bank when the things that do matter finally arrive. Because the genuinely important moment is always coming. In every significant relationship, there will eventually be a crossroads, a decision with real consequences, a conflict where the stakes are genuine and the outcome will shape the trajectory of what comes next. And in that moment, the person who has been generous about the small things over weeks and months and years has something that no amount of last-minute persuasion can create. They have a history of generosity that the other person has felt, absorbed, and internalized. They have a balance of goodwill so deep that when they finally say this one really matters to me, the other person listens differently. Not because they are obligated, but because the relationship has established a pattern in which this person gives and gives and gives, and when they finally ask, the asking carries a weight that the constant demander's asking never could. Contrast this with the person who has won every small battle, who has insisted on their preference, their interpretation, their way at every turn. That person may have the right answer when the big moment arrives. Their judgment may be impeccable, but they are making their case from a deficit. The relational account is empty. The other person has been on the losing side of 1,000 small negotiations, and they are tired. They are not inclined to defer because the relationship has trained them to fight rather than to collaborate. The pattern is contest, not cooperation. And changing that pattern in the moment that matters most is nearly impossible, because patterns that have been established over a long period of time do not reverse because one party suddenly realizes the stakes are higher than usual. Letting others win the small thing is not passivity. It is not people-pleasing. It is not the abandonment of your own needs and preferences. It is the long game played by someone who knows which battles shape the war and which ones are just noise dressed up as significance. It is the wisdom to recognize that the restaurant choice does not matter, but the feeling of being valued in the relationship matters enormously. That the argument about what happened last Tuesday does not matter, but the other person's sense that they are heard and respected matters beyond measure. That the weekend plan does not matter, but the cumulative experience of generosity and flexibility, and I care more about us than I care about being right. That experience, built over hundreds of deferred victories, creates a foundation strong enough to hold the weight of the decisions that actually count. Save your strength, save your insistence, save the full weight of your conviction for the moments that genuinely deserve it, and in every other moment, let it go. Let them choose the restaurant. Let their version of the story stand. Let the small win belong to someone else, not because you are weak, because you are building something, quietly, patiently, generously. You are building the kind of relational wealth that will matter more than every small victory you ever surrendered to accumulate it. Law 14. The law of the returning tide. What you send out comes back amplified. Everything you have read in these pages, every law, every principle, every strategy of stepped-back leadership and calibrated absence and generous mirroring and strategic vulnerability and planted seeds and deferred victories rests on a single foundation, a truth so simple and so consistent that it might be the only thing about human relationships that you ever truly need to understand. What you send out comes back, not always from the direction you sent it, not always in the form you expected, not always on the timeline you would have chosen, but with a consistency and a reliability that over the long arc of a life lived among other human beings is as close to a law of nature as anything in the social world ever gets. When you send out genuine respect, what returns is genuine respect, not always from the same person you gave it to, sometimes from someone you never expected. But the quality of respect you put into the world becomes, over time, the quality of respect that surrounds you. It becomes the water you swim in, the atmosphere you breathe, the baseline expectation of every room you walk into, because rooms remember what you bring to them, and they give it back. When you send out genuine generosity, not the transactional kind that keeps a ledger and expects repayment, but the real kind, the kind that gives because giving is an expression of who you are rather than a strategy for what you want. Something remarkable begins to accumulate around you, a reputation, an ecosystem, a network of human beings who have been touched by your generosity and who carry that experience forward into how they treat you and how they treat everyone else. The generosity ripples outward. It touches people you will never meet. It shapes interactions you will never see. And it comes back, not always as a direct return, but as a quality of life, a richness of connection, a depth of human relationship that cannot be purchased or manufactured or manipulated into existence. When you send out patience, real patience, the kind that gives another person time and space and the dignity of finding their own way at their own pace, what returns is the kind of trust that impatience never earns. The trust of someone who knows that you will not rush them, will not pressure them, will not make them feel that their pace is a burden, and that trust, once established, opens doors that force and urgency keep permanently locked. And when you send out manipulation, even sophisticated manipulation, even the kind that is so well disguised that it achieves its short-term objectives flawlessly, what returns is the slow, steady erosion of exactly what the manipulation was trying to build. Because manipulation carries a message inside it, hidden beneath the strategy, and the message is this: I do not believe that genuine interaction with you will get me what I want. I do not trust the natural process of human exchange to work in my favor. I believe that I need to engineer your behavior because you cannot be relied upon to respond to honesty. And people receive that message, not always consciously, not always immediately, but they feel it. Something does not sit right. Something about the interaction leaves a residue of unease that they cannot quite name, but that they absolutely trust. And over time, they act on it. They pull back. They guard themselves. They stop offering the genuine, open, trusting engagement that the manipulator was trying to extract, because the manipulation itself has poisoned the well that it was drawing from. The person who treats others as instruments to be managed, however skillfully, eventually finds themselves surrounded by managed instruments, by alliances that are transactions waiting to be renegotiated, by loyalties that are leases with expiration dates, by a landscape of human connection that is thin and brittle and exhausting to maintain, because it is held together by strategy rather than by genuine care, and it requires constant maintenance to keep from falling apart. The person who treats others as genuine human beings, whose interests are real and whose well-being matters, who brings to their interactions the same honesty and respect and patience they hope to receive, finds themselves over time in a completely different landscape. A landscape where support does not need to be purchased because it is offered freely, where loyalty is not leveraged because it is genuinely felt, where the connections between people are thick and resilient and sustaining because they are built on the only material that actually holds over time. Genuine human care. This is the deepest law, and in some sense, it contains all the others. Because every principle in this collection, every technique of reverse psychology, every strategy of indirect influence is ultimately an expression of the same underlying truth. The most effective way to move through the world is not to force it into the shape you want. It is to offer it something genuine and let the world respond to what you have offered. The most effective way to influence others is not to push them toward your desired outcome. It is to be someone worth being influenced by and let the natural dynamics of trust and respect and genuine human connection do the work that force and strategy and manipulation never sustainably achieve. Closing. The person who wants less creates more desire. The person who pushes less creates more movement. The person who leads invisibly creates more genuine commitment. The person who reveals their cracks creates more genuine trust. The person who surrenders the small victories accumulates the capital for the ones that matter. And the person who sends out into the world genuine respect, genuine curiosity, genuine care for the people around them, creates, over the long and patient course of a life well lived, an environment that returns those qualities amplified, transformed, and multiplied in ways that no strategy could have predicted and no manipulation could have produced. These 14 laws are not tricks. They are not hacks. They are not shortcuts to getting what you want from people who do not know they are being played. They are an invitation to engage with the world more honestly, more patiently, more intelligently, and with a deeper respect for how human beings actually work rather than how we wish they would work. They are an invitation to stop fighting the current and start understanding it, to stop pushing against a grain of human psychology and start moving with it. The paradox is real. It has always been real, and it will be real long after you finish reading these words. Stop trying to control everything, and the world becomes more navigable. Stop trying to force every outcome, and outcomes begin to move in your direction. Stop performing power, and genuine power becomes available to you in ways you never expected. The tide is waiting. What you send out will come back. The only question that remains, the one that only you can answer, is this: what are you going to send?